The Steve Harvey Show studio was filled with its usual afternoon energy. It was Wednesday, October 18th, 2023, and the Chicago studio audience had settled into their seats, ready for another episode of heartfelt conversations, laughter, and Steve's signature wisdom. The stage was set with its familiar warm lighting, the comfortable chairs positioned for intimate conversation, and the cameras ready to capture whatever authentic moments would unfold. Steve Harvey walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, wearing one of his impeccably tailored suits, his signature smile radiating warmth. The audience stood, clapping and cheering, as he made his way to his seat. This was his element, connecting with real people, hearing real stories, and offering real guidance. "Good afternoon, everybody," Steve's voice boomed through the studio. "How y'all doing today?" The audience responded with enthusiastic cheers. Steve settled into his chair, looking at his notes briefly, before addressing the cameras with his characteristic directness. "Today we've got some incredible guests," Steve began. "But there's one woman I want you to meet who has a story that's going to change the way you think about second chances, about redemption, and about what one person can do when they decide to turn their pain into purpose." The audience quieted with anticipation. Steve's tone had shifted from entertainer to storyteller, and everyone in the studio could sense that something significant was about to happen. "Please welcome to the stage Rachel Martinez." From the wings, a woman in her mid-40s walked out. Rachel Martinez moved with quiet confidence, her dark hair pulled back simply, wearing a modest blue dress. There was something in her eyes, a depth that suggested she had seen things most people only read about. The audience applauded warmly as she took her seat across from Steve. "Rachel, thank you for being here," Steve said, his voice gentle. "I've read your story, and I have to tell you, I don't cry easily, but your journey made me tear up. Before we get into everything, I want to ask you something simple. How are you doing today?" Rachel smiled, a genuine smile that carried both sadness and hope. "I'm doing well, Steve. Better than I ever thought possible." Steve leaned forward slightly. "Rachel, I want to take our audience back to where your story begins, because they need to understand where you came from to appreciate where you are now. Can you tell us about your childhood?" Rachel took a deep breath, her hands clasped in her lap. "I grew up in South Phoenix, in a neighborhood where opportunities were limited, and survival was the daily focus. My father left before I was born, and my mother worked 3 jobs trying to keep us afloat. She did her best, but she was never home. By the time I was 14, I was raising myself." The studio was silent, everyone listening intently. Steve nodded, encouraging her to continue. "At 15, I met a boy who paid attention to me," Rachel continued. "He was older, involved in things he shouldn't have been involved in, but he made me feel seen. By 16, I was pregnant. By 17, I was a single mother living in my mother's apartment with a baby girl named Sofia." Rachel's voice wavered slightly, but she pushed forward. "I tried, Steve. I really tried. I got my GED. I worked at a grocery store. I did everything I could think of, but it wasn't enough. The bills kept piling up. Sofia needed things I couldn't afford, and I felt like I was drowning." Steve's expression was one of deep empathy. He had heard countless stories in his career, but there was something about Rachel's honesty that commanded attention. "When Sofia was 3 years old," Rachel said, her voice dropping lower, "I made the worst decision of my life. Someone I knew offered me a way to make fast money. It was illegal, it was dangerous, but I was desperate, and I convinced myself I was doing it for my daughter." The audience remained silent, no one judging, everyone simply listening. "Within 6 months, I was arrested," Rachel said. "Possession with intent to distribute. The evidence was overwhelming. I was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Sofia was 4 years old. My mother took custody of her, and I was sent to a correctional facility 300 miles away." Steve shook his head slowly, his eyes glistening. "Rachel, what was that first night in prison like?" Rachel's composure cracked slightly. "It was the worst night of my life. I lay on that hard bunk bed, and all I could think about was Sofia. I could hear her voice in my head, asking for her mama. I realized that in trying to provide for her, I had abandoned her in the worst possible way. I had chosen crime over being her mother, and now she would grow up without me. A few audience members were visibly emotional now, wiping their eyes. "But here's what I need you to understand," Rachel said, her voice gaining strength. "That night, as terrible as it was also the night I made a decision. I decided that if I was going to be away from my daughter for 12 years, I was going to become someone worth coming home to. I was going to use that time to transform myself into the mother Sofia deserved." Steve sat back in his chair, clearly moved. "Talk to me about that transformation. What did you do?" Rachel's eyes lit up with a fierce determination. "I did everything. I enrolled in every program the prison offered. I got my associate's degree in social work through a correspondence program. I became a peer counselor, helping other women deal with addiction and trauma. I took parenting classes even though I couldn't see my daughter. I read every book I could get my hands on about child development, about healing, about change." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But the most important thing I did was start a support group for mothers in prison. We called it Letters to Tomorrow. Every week we would meet and write letters to our children, letters to our future selves, letters about who we wanted to become. We held each other accountable. We cried together, we prayed together, and we refused to let prison break us." The audience began to applaud, but Steve held up his hand, knowing there was more to the story. "Rachel, you served 8 years of your 12-year sentence before you were released on parole. Tell us about the day you got out." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. "It was March 15th, 2019. I walked out of that prison at 6 in the morning, and my mother was there with Sofia, who was now 12 years old. She was taller than I remembered, more grown up, and I was terrified she wouldn't want anything to do with me." "What happened?" Steve asked softly. "She ran to me," Rachel said, tears now flowing freely. "She ran straight into my arms and held me so tight. She said, 'Mama, I never stopped believing you'd come home.' In that moment, I knew that every single day of work I'd done on myself had been worth it." The audience erupted in applause, many people standing, moved by Rachel's story of reunion, but Steve's expression suggested there was more to come. "Rachel, getting out of prison is one thing. Building a life after prison is another. What happened next?" Rachel wiped her eyes and straightened in her chair. "I moved back in with my mother and Sofia. I was on parole, which meant I had strict check-ins, curfews, and employment requirements. Finding a job with a felony record was almost impossible. I applied to over 100 places in the first month. I got 2 interviews, and both ended as soon as they saw my background check." She continued, "I was starting to feel hopeless again. But then I remembered something one of my counselors in prison had told me. Your past doesn't define your future unless you let it. So I decided to create my own opportunity." Steve leaned forward, intrigued. "What did you do?" "I started small," Rachel explained. "I began offering free peer counseling at a local community center for women struggling with addiction and incarceration. I used everything I'd learned in prison, all those certifications and all that experience. Word spread, and within 3 months, the community center offered me a part-time paid position." Rachel's voice grew stronger. "But I didn't want to stop there. I knew there were thousands of women like me, women coming out of prison with nowhere to go, no one to help them, and no hope for the future. So I started writing a proposal for a non-profit organization that would provide housing, job training, and support for formerly incarcerated mothers." "And did anyone listen?" Steve asked. Rachel smiled broadly now. "It took 2 years of knocking on doors, sending emails, and giving presentations to anyone who would listen. I was rejected by 37 potential donors and grant organizations. But on the 38th try, a local philanthropist believed in my vision. She gave me seed funding to start the program." The audience applauded again, but Steve held up his hand once more. "Tell them what happened after that, Rachel. Tell them about the 47 women. Rachel's eyes shone with pride and emotion. We opened Second Chance Home in January 2022. It's a transitional living facility specifically for mothers coming out of prison. We provide housing for up to 6 months, job training, counseling, legal support, and help with reunification with their children. She paused, her voice thick with emotion. To date, we've served 47 women, 47 mothers who were exactly where I was, broken, scared, and desperate for a chance to rebuild their lives. Of those 47 women, 43 have successfully transitioned to independent living, secured stable employment, and reconnected with their children. The studio erupted. People were on their feet, applauding, crying, and celebrating Rachel's incredible journey. Steve Harvey stood as well, his eyes filled with tears, clapping along with the audience. When the applause finally subsided, Steve walked over to Rachel and embraced her in a long, heartfelt hug. When he stepped back, he had to take a moment to compose himself. "Rachel Martinez," Steve began, his voice breaking slightly. "You took the worst moment of your life and turned it into a mission to save others. You went from being incarcerated to being someone who liberates others from the cycle of incarceration. Do you understand how extraordinary that is?" Rachel shook her head humbly. "Steve, I'm not extraordinary. I'm just someone who refused to let one mistake define the rest of my life. Every single one of those 47 women has the same strength I do. They just needed someone to believe in them." Steve turned to address the audience directly. "How many of y'all have made mistakes in your life? How many have done things you're not proud of?" Nearly every hand in the studio went up. "That's what I thought," Steve said. "Rachel's story reminds us that our worst moments don't have to be our defining moments. She could have come out of prison bitter, angry, and given up. Instead, she came out determined to ensure no other mother would face what she faced alone." Steve returned to his seat, but he wasn't done yet. "Rachel, I want to bring someone out here. I want our audience to meet the reason you changed your life. Please welcome Sofia Martinez." Rachel's hands flew to her mouth in shock as a beautiful 16-year-old girl emerged from backstage. Sofia walked straight to her mother, and they embraced as the audience cheered and cried. When they finally separated, Sofia sat down next to her mother, holding her hand tightly. Steve gave them a moment before speaking. "Sofia, you were 4 years old when your mother went to prison. You're 16 now. What do you want people to know about your mum?" Sofia looked at Rachel with pure love in her eyes. "I want people to know that my mum is the strongest person I've ever met. She could have given up on herself and on me, but she didn't. She wrote me letters every single week for 8 years. She called me whenever she could. She made sure I knew that even though she couldn't be there physically, she was always my mother." Sofia's voice grew stronger. "But what I'm most proud of is what she's doing now. My mum is saving women who are just like she was. She's giving them hope when everyone else has given up on them. That's the woman who raised me. That's my hero." There wasn't a dry eye in the studio. Steve had to turn away briefly to compose himself, wiping his face with his hand. "Sofia, your mother is lucky to have you," Steve finally said. "Rachel, your daughter is remarkable. The fact that she turned out this strong, this loving, this supportive speaks to the foundation you gave her, even before you went away." Steve looked at both of them, then addressed the audience again. "This is what second chances look like, y'all. This is what happens when someone refuses to be defined by their worst day." Rachel didn't just serve her time, she transformed herself, and now she's transforming the lives of dozens of other women. But Steve had one more surprise. "Rachel, you've been working out of a small rented house that fits 6 women at a time. Your dream is to expand Second Chance Home to accommodate 20 women. You've been fundraising for 2 years to make that happen." Rachel nodded, clearly wondering where this was going. "Well," Steve said with a growing smile, "I made some phone calls. Our show has partnered with several corporate sponsors who believe in your mission. We're going to fully fund your expansion. You're getting a new facility that can house 20 women, and we're providing operational funding for the first year." Rachel's hands covered her face as she broke down completely. Sofia was crying too, hugging her mother as the audience gave another standing ovation. "But wait," Steve continued. "There's more. We're also providing scholarships for 10 of your residents to attend vocational training programs, and we've partnered with local businesses to guarantee job interviews for your graduates." Rachel couldn't speak. She simply sobbed with gratitude, holding Sofia and nodding her thanks to Steve and the audience. When the cameras stopped rolling that day, something remarkable happened. Over 30 audience members approached Rachel to volunteer with Second Chance Home. 5 offered to donate additional funds, and 7 women quietly shared that they too had been incarcerated and that Rachel's story had given them hope for their own futures. The episode aired 3 weeks later and immediately went viral. The clip of Rachel revealing her transformation and Sofia's tribute to her mother was shared over 80 million times across social media platforms. But the real impact happened in communities across the country. Within 6 months, Rachel received inquiries from over 200 cities asking how to replicate the Second Chance Home model. Formerly incarcerated women reached out by the thousands, sharing their own stories and asking for guidance. The hashtag 47lives became a movement, with people sharing stories of second chances, redemption, and transformation. The number 47 became symbolic of the ripple effect one person's change can create. Today, Rachel Martinez runs a network of 12 second chance homes across 6 states. Over 300 women have graduated from the program, with a success rate that outperforms traditional re-entry programs by over 60%. Sofia Martinez, now preparing for college, has decided to study social work, inspired by her mother's journey. She interns at Second Chance Home during summers, working directly with the children of incarcerated mothers, helping them navigate the same pain she experienced. Steve Harvey's response to Rachel's story proved that his show is more than entertainment. It's a platform for transformation, redemption, and hope. His willingness to not just listen, but to act created opportunities that changed hundreds of lives. Rachel Martinez went on the Steve Harvey Show, expecting to share her story. Instead, she ignited a movement that reminded America that people are more than their worst mistakes, that mothers deserve second chances, and that transformation is always possible when someone believes in you. The woman who saved 47 lives started by saving her own, and in doing so, she showed all of us that our darkest moments can become the foundation for our greatest purpose.